Welcome to another edition of the NCBI Podcast. I'm June Tinsley, Head of Communications and Advocacy with NCBI. And today my guest is Peader Golden, who is Country Manager with Peader. And our chat will really focus on the use of e-scooters and their safe usage and the legislation that will flow from it. Peader operates a number of shared schemes in different countries. So Peader will be able to tell us all about that. Thanks very much, Peader, for having a chat with me today.
Thank you, June, for having me.
Great. I suppose for the benefit of our listeners, if you could just tell us a little bit about Peader and what the company is all about and where your current shared schemes are in use.
Yeah, sure. So Tier Mobility is now a global leader in micro-mobility. We operate across 580 cities in 33 countries, and we offer e-scooter, pedal bikes, e-bike and e-moped schemes. And very much we're trying to support cities, councils with both their active travel and sustainability goals. And from an Irish perspective, we launched Tier's business in Ireland about 2 years ago, and it commenced with a scheme on DCU, so Dublin City University, where we had a number of e-scooters that were available both to the public and students. And I'm glad to say we've had over 4,000 trips now there without incident. And then in the last sort of 8 months, we launched an e-bike scheme in Fingal County Council. And here, this is where the public have access to electric bikes right across Fingal Council. They can download the Tier app, and then it's just a pay-as-you-go service.
Yeah, I've seen them around the Fingal area myself, and they're nice bright green colours, so people can easily see them, and they obviously have designated parking bays as well for ease of parking. I suppose in relation to the e-scooters, just for people's benefit, the legislation has been crawling through the Oireachtas for the last number of years. It all falls under the Road Bill of 1961 that they're trying to modernise. And NCBI has been collaborating with many other agencies, including Irish Wheelchair Association and the Irish Guide Dogs, to kind of ensure that there's minimum safety standards included in the regulations, particularly to ensure that pedestrians are protected on our footpaths. And I suppose at the present stage, the legislation is really at its final hurdle, and it's hoped to pass into law very, very quickly, and subsequently regulations will flow from that, which will be applicable to all local authorities and police and anybody who's going to be enforcing the rules that are enshrined in the legislation. As it presently stands, there's many private owners rather of e-scooters right across the country, but the legislation around it is non-existent. So I suppose that's why we kind of want to put in minimum safety standards. There's now no present shared schemes in use in Ireland, but Tier and other companies will be putting in pitches to try and roll out such shared schemes across cities when the legislation and regulations are in place. So in terms of context, that really explains where we're at with e-scooter usage. And I suppose from NCBI's perspective, some of the minimum standards that we want to see include things like the banning of e-scooters on footpaths. Disappointingly, it's not in the legislation in its present form, and we hope it will be in the regulations. But I suppose what's Tier's position in relation to this request to ban their usage on footpaths, really to protect people who are blind or vision impaired, other vulnerable pedestrians, even parents out with buggies and small children and all that kind of stuff. What's Tier's position on that?
Yeah, June, we're aligned, I suppose, with NCBI here, and that e-scooters are not meant to be ridden on pavements, and I suppose if you look at the reason on why e-scooters go on the path, it's very much driven that the infrastructure isn't in place and people don't feel safe, on the sort of cycle lanes or light mobility lanes that are in place. So we very much see, across Europe where there's a strong infrastructure in place, and that actually reduces the amount of individuals that would mount a pavement. So we're fully aligned that we would like to see that banned. I think the advantages with a public shared scheme is that there's technologies, I suppose, that can be implemented to, limit that behavior. So for instance, we can define certain zones within the app, which would prevent, say, a scooter going in or operating in those given areas. We can identify, areas that we deem need to be go slow zones, and so we can reduce the speed of an e-scooter. And also, in terms of actioning a given incident, all our vehicles are geotagged, so we know exactly where they are at any given point in time. So if an individual or a pedestrian or someone from the public does report an incident of such behavior, well, actually we can identify the individuals involved. We can provide educational material, warnings, and actually, if no behavior does change, we can remove them from the service.
And I suppose, thank you for highlighting that whole issue around nearly accountability, because certainly it's cropped up time and time again from the service users that we've engaged with on this topic. 77% of them have reported an incident or a near miss collision with an e-scooter on a footpath. And I suppose that the question posed then is, when incidents do occur, because there's no insurance, there's no identification and no potential registration in it, where we're presently at in terms of regulations, who has to foot the bill if somebody gets injured as a result of an e-scooter? Certainly, we know from the evidence in James's Hospital, the likelihood of head injuries is quite high amongst riders who have experienced an accident. But I'm just curious, from a pedestrian's perspective, if there is a collision, what is TIER's response in relation to remedying that situation as much as they can, admittedly?
Yeah, so I suppose I can't really speak from a privately owned scooter
Understandable.
perspective, and the legislation and regulation is going to come through there. But from a public perspective or a public shared scheme perspective, TIER would have insurances in place, be it from an employer and from a rider perspective, to address any instances that may occur.
And what will be the minimum age requirement that you will be imposing on individuals who would use your shared schemes?
So I believe the legislation or a regulation will come through requesting minimum age of 16, and then there'll be verification checks done as part of the onboarding process to ensure that is in place.
And in terms of your experience internationally, is 16 the usual age of the shared schemes that apply that TIER run?
Correct. So across, I suppose, Europe, actually globally, 16 is the minimum age, and that's that's the current age verification requirements in Ireland for the e-bike schemes that are live.
And I suppose for 16 was certainly the age that we were requesting when we were seeking to impose these minimum standards, because of the rationale, as you said, it's a common age internationally, but also kind of demonstrates an understanding of the rules of the road, and a bit of kind of, it's going to have more maturity. A 16-year-old will have more maturity than a 10-year-old on an e-scooter. And I suppose it is something that we believe should be enshrined in the regulations, if it's not in the legislation itself.
Yeah, and what I also think is really important to stress here, the onus also has to be on the individuals using this mode of transport. Like once they get familiar with, say, the e-scooter, and there's a number of ongoing works in terms of supporting with the education of the new vehicle mode, it's the same rules of the road will apply as if you were riding a bike or driving a car. I think that's not going to be subject to change.
And in terms of your shared schemes, do you offer helmets, for example, for riders, or are riders expected to bring their own helmets, or how does that work from a practical perspective?
Yeah, so that won't be embedded into the legislation. However, like in the Dublin City University scheme, all our scooters have a helmet box on them. So the user has the option to actually utilize a foldable helmet that is with the vehicle.
Okay. I mean, for the rider's own safety, it is important, we believe, to have a helmet, because if the legislation remains unchanged, the speed could go up to 25 kilometres an hour, which, as we know, is very fast. I suppose NCBI's perspective would be that the speed limit be lower than that. And you mentioned earlier a couple of go slow areas would also be included to facilitate a lower speed limit, again, even potentially down to 6 kilometres an hour. How does TIER utilise those go slow areas in other cities?
Yeah, so what we've experienced in other cities is you can identify potential high risk areas, so it could be where you see a certain speed of a given scooter at a junction. And in turn, that's where you might identify that actually this should be identified as a go slow area, to reduce the potential of an accident. So in that regard, it's working with, I think, the councils, local bodies, to understand, where what is needed in given areas, and then what you do is you develop the scheme for a given area. So that's why it's so important to have that engagement locally to really ensure that you have the safest and most inclusive scheme for that given area.
Yeah, and I suppose that's probably one of the reasons why it's not necessarily outlined in legislation, but there's scope to do that in regulations because it can be applied at a more local level. I suppose the other issue that NCBI was a strong champion on is the insertion of a universal sound into the e-scooter design, because again, for individuals who are blind or vision impaired, they will not be able to see these silent vehicles come. And it certainly, from our experience, has startled many individuals as they approach. And as I said, in some cases, has led to collisions. The use of e-scooters we're hearing on footpaths is leading to individuals, it's compromising their confidence and their independence to get about safely because they can't see these e-scooters approach. So to insert a universal sound that's fully robustly tested is something that we would be a strong advocate of. And I'm just curious to see what Peadar's position is in relation to that.
Yeah, and I think you've somewhat hit the nail on the head there, in the sense that, it has to be a universal sound and has to be robust. So we're currently working with the University College of London for the last year, actually, to create that universal sound. So that's currently going through testing at the minute, with a number of different bodies being brought in to facilitate that testing and validate it. So such as the National Sight Loss Council, the Thomas Polican Trust. And here, what we're trying to do is work on creating a sound, that enables a pedestrian to not only understand that a vehicle's approaching, but also, the speed it's approaching and the location it's coming from. So with that development, hopefully as it progresses, then that is something that can be scaled. And once it is in a position to be tested in the field, we would hope to roll that out in Ireland also, to understand its impact in different environments.
And I suppose this would be just a request that the testing phase would also include, excuse me, would also include the opportunity to be tested in Ireland, because not every roadscape is going to be similar to the London testing ground, for example. So just for diversity, to ensure it's robustly tested, I would request that it would be tested in Ireland too.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we're fortunate in the sense that we do have a scheme up and running in Dublin City University. So that should enable the testing to be held within Ireland imminently.
And in terms of the designated parking bays, certainly this again was an issue that we would have liked to see included in the legislation, because the absence of designated parking bays means that e-scooters can and are propped up against poles or trees and can pose trip hazards for individuals. So I suppose we were adamant that there would be designated parking bays. With shared schemes, those parking bays come as standard, I'm sure. And I suppose it's just to flag that I hope it is in the plan for Peadar to have a bank of designated parking bays that are clearly marked separate to the footpath or the road area, so that individuals who are blind or vision impaired can decipher where a parking bay starts and ends and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, with regards to, I suppose, the Fingal e-bike scheme, we are implementing mandatory parking zones, which are working well. I suppose the main issue we have here is that a lot of the public infrastructure in terms of bike parking, or be it scooter parking against Sheffield stands, is that infrastructure is on main streets. It's not spread into, say, residential housing. So it's very much limiting the use case for the given vehicles. So if you really want to, make that transition away from the private car, you need to ensure that the parking infrastructure is there. And what I'm currently doing is working with the tier safety board, and that includes obviously NCBI and a number of other bodies across Ireland to understand, well, what are the requirements for a parking area? Like, what do we want to see? And we've commenced this trial in Blanchardstown specifically, where we've identified, areas that we call of, I'm going to call it dead space, and how could that be utilized for the parking of the vehicles. And we're building now up the requirements for these given parking locations that could then be utilized going forward, to define where vehicles could be and should be parked.
And I suppose that won't be rolled out overnight. And I suppose it's just a question of sequencing the timing of these kind of things, so that if shared schemes become operational, designated parking bays become widespreadly available. And I think it's also important to flag that shared schemes in and of themselves are really valuable. But these kind of use of designated parking bays will not apply to private owners. So there's a whole piece there, we believe, around education of riders to make sure that where they park their e-scooters is considered, so that no obstacles are presented.
Correct. And I think just going back from a public shared scheme perspective, I appreciate that it may take time to implement the required infrastructure, but there's also alternative means, on how we could define these mandatory parking areas. Like across Europe, and something we're looking at with another scheme that's about to launch in Ireland, is almost virtual parking zones. So this is where you define the space in the given app, and that's where the vehicle can be left. There can be an identifier on the ground in terms of this is that mandatory parking zone where a vehicle can be left. But what we're trying to do is, work with the bodies to understand what are the requirements that are needed to define this given zone, and in turn, does that actually mean that a physical infrastructure is required for that parking bay? So that's the current area of focus.
And I suppose just in terms of the individuals who will be availing of your scheme, will there be an expectation that they will have to undergo some kind of training with yourselves in order to become a member? And I suppose what we're flagging here is the importance to riders of the increasing their own awareness around vulnerable pedestrians and being alert to other road users and pedestrians.
Yeah, no. So look, through the onboarding process, there is an educational flow in terms of this new mode of transport for an individual. So there will be that flow, and we constantly have a feed of a news feed providing information, be it giving updates in terms of how vehicles should be ridden, what's the latest technology available, and there'll also be FAQ sections that people can go to. Whenever we launch a new scheme, a new city, we very much hold local community events where we'll enable the public to trial the scooters or an e-bike with experts on hand to give that training. So we like to work closely, be it with community bodies, with councils, to provide that educational material to the community.
Because I do feel that that's a very important piece of the jigsaw is rider education, and with upskilling riders, then hopefully into the long term, accidents can be prevented. So I hope that that's an important thing to flag. The other thing I just would like to highlight is in terms of the technology you mentioned earlier about activating scooters to go slow in the go slow areas and things like that. How accurate are those? I suppose, again, what we've heard is individuals kind of flagging with us that some e-scooters, when they approach a zone that will essentially prevent them from going at a certain speed, the braking system is very, very sharp, and as a result, the rider wobbles and potentially falls off. So I suppose my question really is, have those kind of things been considered so that there's a gradual reduction of speed, and that there's a greater awareness of those issues around the technology in use?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, look, the technology is continuing to advance daily, and what you have with, be it the go slow zones or the no go zones, is it's not a sudden stop. There is that slow ramp down, so that, I suppose, the incidents that you just referred to don't actually occur. So they are definitely being considered and constantly being updated to ensure, I suppose, the safest, be it software and technology, is being implemented when implementing such zones.
And I suppose the riders will be upskilled in their awareness and knowledge of that technology when they become active members with the tier shared scheme.
Correct. And within the app itself as well, these areas are clearly identified on the map. So you'll see them identified in sort of red shaded out areas.
Okay. And I suppose lastly, just in terms of the work Tier is doing, you mentioned earlier the safety committee. If you could just tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've created, I suppose, the first safety board in Ireland with a number of bodies such as NCBI, Walk 21, Inclusion Ireland, and the Irish Wheelchair Association. And what we're trying to do is we get together quarterly where Tier will provide an update in terms of the work Tier is doing, be it locally, but also globally. We'll share our latest learnings. And then here it's also the opportunity really to get engagement from those bodies to understand their needs and requirements, so that, that when we're speaking, be it with councils, with governments, and defining our own strategies, that we're taking on board, their requirements, their needs. And this is the only way it works for me, is that, we have to understand what is the local aspect to make a scheme successful. And if we embed those local needs and requirements from the get-go, then we're going to create that, successful scheme that is inclusive and that is safe.
And obviously, as you said, NCBI is part of that safety board. And the other piece of work that NCBI is doing in this space is the micro mobility module. And do you want to explain a little bit more about Tier's involvement in that?
Absolutely. So I think it's been a great initiative that NCBI have taken on to provide that education material, be it to the community for both private scooters and a public shared scheme. So this education material will give an overview in terms of, the difference between both, and what to consider, be it from a rider's perspective and a pedestrian's perspective. And hopefully that will support in giving that awareness of the new mode of transport for when it does come through legislation and then onto the roads in the coming months.
Yeah, and I think that's the reality is that e-scooters are just become so popular so quickly that we're nearly trying to catch up in that regard to make sure that riders are appropriately educated and informed. And likewise, that the legislation needs to catch up too. And I hope that the legislation does get through quickly enough, and subsequently that the minimum standards that we wanted in the legislation are now going to be enshrined in the regulations. And I think the other side of the coin is around enforcement, because there will be a responsibility on local authorities, on the police, to ensure the enforcement with the legislation. And tell me, how are Tier going to work with on the enforcement side?
So we currently have safety officers that will be a point of contact for police. So if there is any instances that do occur, the police have a direct line to contact us where information can be provided. We'll also review, all inbounds that are received within 24 hours, and that's where then the team will take action given or dependent on the situation that did occur. So like I highlighted, I suppose earlier, every single vehicle is geotagged, so we know its position at any given point in time. And from any reports that come in, we can review a given trip, identify what did occur, and then take the appropriate action.
And I suppose, as I said, enforcement is something that we will be monitoring, because we want to make sure that individuals who are blind or vision impaired do continuously feel safe out and about, and have the confidence to get about safely. Thanks very much, Peadar, for outlining everything that Tier is doing in this space. Happy that NCBI is collaborating with you, and that there's many overlaps with some of the issues we've raised here this morning. And we wait and see what happens now with the next stage of the legislation and the rollout of shared schemes. But for now, thank you very much, Peadar. If anybody is interested in learning more about Tier, what's the best website that you can direct people to?
Yeah, absolutely. They can just download the app, tier.app.
Tier.app. Thank you very much. For our listeners, if anybody is interested in learning more about NCBI's position around e-scooters, jump onto our website, ncbi.ie. Our info line, as always, is accessible through 1-800-911-250. All previous editions of these podcasts are available on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, and all podcasting platforms, or alternatively jump onto our website. But for now, I'd just like to say huge thanks to Peadar, and best of luck with everything.
Thank you, June.